Morning and welcome to day 4 of Matter 6 of the examination. My name is Kelly Ford and I, along with Kevin Ward, have been appointed to examine the Solihull local plan. Kelly Akins is the programme officer. Today we're going to discuss matters 6C and 6D. Before we start, for the benefit of those joining for the first time today, I just want to provide a quick reminder of the format of this session. It's okay for you to keep your cameras on, but please turn off your microphone when you're not speaking to avoid any problems with background noise. When you wish to speak on any matter on the agenda, if you could raise your hand using the raise hand function, and I'll bring you in at an appropriate point. Please remember to lower your hand when you've spoken, and please don't use any of the other emojis. We usually start and finish with the council. When you are speaking, please be concise. There's no need to repeat what others have said or what you've said in your statements. The aim is to move the discussion on from those documents and deal with areas that need further clarification or explanation. During the breaks, if you could stay logged on to the meeting, but turn your camera and microphone off so we can't see or hear you. And please be aware that the sessions are being live streamed on the council's YouTube channel. I won't ask people to introduce themselves now, but if you could say who you are and who you represent the first time we speak, that would be helpful. I don't think the programme officer has been provided with a list of participants from the council today. So could somebody please just confirm who is representing the council today, please?
Good morning, Mom. Hopefully you can hear me.
I can, thank you.
Good. My name's Gary Palmer from the Planning Policy team at Solihull, and joining me in the room today are Mark Andrews, Walter Bailey, Emma Tinsley and Katie Johnson. And then as part of the council's team remotely is Giles Cannock, QC and Dean Ward.
Thank you. Finally, as it's Remembrance Day today, we should be observing the 2 minutes silence at 11 o'clock. Are there any questions on the format or any procedural questions before we start? Can't see any hands raised, so we'll turn to site SO1, which is referenced east of Solihull. So can the council start please by explaining how the site came to be allocated?
Hello, my name's Katie Johnson. Can you hear me okay?
I can, thank you, and I can see you.
Sorry, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. So regarding SO1, through the spatial strategy and given the limited land in the urban area, the council looked around the urban edge for opportunities for large-scale urban extensions. The overall approach topic paper, document reference 018 at Appendix A, sets out the area east of Solihull between Canal and the A41 is considered suitable for growth. The western area to Field Lane is generally of medium to high accessibility in the accessibility mapping study. The area performs relatively poorly in the Greenbelt assessment with scores 4 to 5, and that generally reflects the existence of urban influences, especially the existing ribbon development along Hampton Lane. The site itself was promoted as various land parcels through the 2016 Call for Sites exercise. It falls within Growth Option G of the spatial strategy as a large-scale urban extension. It is in a sustainable location close to the full range of services and facilities in the town centre of Solihull. It's in a lower performing greenbelt parcel and is well contained by the canal and Field Lane, which will provide the new and defensible greenbelt boundary. It's predominantly on land to the rear of properties, which already form a ribbon of development along Hampton Lane. The location is also close to where the need arises. Thank you.
Thank you. And could you just confirm the conclusions of the Greenbelt assessment, please, in relation to this site?
Good morning, it's Emma Tinsley from the Planning Policy team. So the site lies within Refined Parcels RP27, which is the area that covers the area between Lugtrout Lane and the canal, and RP 29, which includes the land between Lugtrout Lane and Hampton Lane. So both parcels perform the same in terms of how well they perform against each greenbelt purpose. And the parcels were given a score of 0 to 3 to reflect how well they performed against each of those purposes, with 0 being performs no purpose and 3 being the highly performing purpose. So in terms of purpose 1, to check the unrestricted sprawl of large built-up areas, the site is low performing against the parcel, largely because ribbon development is already present along Hampton Lane and to some extent Lugtrout Lane. To prevent neighbouring towns merging into one another, the parcels perform more moderately and was given a score of 2, and the refined parcel forms a gap of approximately 1 kilometre at the moment between Catherine de Barnes and the main urban area. In terms of purpose 3, to assist in safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, again, the parcels perform lower, again, characterised by countryside, but it does have some development present in the parcel. And in terms of purpose 4, to preserve the setting and character of historic towns, the parcels don't perform against that purpose. So overall, there's a total score of 4 for both parcels, which is a lower performing greenbelt parcel overall. So the council considered there's only going to be a limited to moderate impact on the greenbelt for the purposes identified, particularly given that development's already present in that area. Thank you.
Thank you. And the exceptional circumstances for taking the land out of the greenbelt?
Yeah, these are set out in our hearing matter statement at MO6C-012, and they include the fact that development would provide a significant number of new homes to address the overall housing need and affordable housing need in the borough in the absence of non-greenbelt sites. The site's in a lower performing parcel of greenbelt overall when assessed against the purposes of including land in the greenbelt. The site is on the edge of the main urban area of Solihull. It's close to the town centre in Eldon with its full range of services and facilities. And again, as has been said before, it's close to where the need arises. And the site has existing development on two sides, to the west and the south, so sort of Pinfold Road area and Hampton Lane, and it has strong physical features which will provide the new greenbelt boundary, which include the canal, Hampton Lane and Field Lane.
Okay, and are there any physical or other constraints which could have an impact on the development of the site?
Yeah, the principles in point 2 of the policy seek to address the potential constraints to development. So there are some heritage assets on the site. So the listed buildings, Field Farm and 237 Lugtrout Lane will need to be considered. The site also accommodates some sport pitches. I think it's Colts Football Club. So those pitches will be retained as part of the proposal. The landscape assessment does identify some significant trees and historic hedgerows within the site, and there are some TPO trees largely confined to the boundary of the site, sort of Lugtrout Lane and Hampton Lane. There are some areas of woodland around the eastern edges of the site, the western edges of the site, sorry, and an electricity transmission line passes through the site. It's sort of the northeastern and corner of the site. So they will need to be considered in the future design and layout of any development, and they have been taken into account in the council's concept master planning process. It's not considered that any of those constraints are a significant constraint to development or would prevent the allocation coming forward in any way.
Okay. And what infrastructure requirements are needed to support the proposed allocation?
Again, the infrastructure requirements are set out in the policy. We've had sort of discussions with providers, and some of the infrastructure also comes from the evidence base that we've used. So we've worked with colleagues in school place planning, where they've confirmed that it's not anticipated that any further additional primary school places will be required, but that the area should be kept under general review. In terms of secondary places, the area is served by Lode Heath Secondary School, which can accommodate the demand from both sites, both this site and SO2, which we'll come on to later in the morning, within its current capacity. So again, it would be a case of discussions with the local education authority as to what extent contributions are required, and these would likely be secured by a Section 106 agreement. In terms of health, the council has also been in discussions with the clinical commissioning group, and developer contributions will be required to primary and secondary healthcare, again in consultation with the CCG. Highway improvements will also be needed to provide access from Damson Parkway and Looktrout Lane, and the infrastructure delivery plan reference 702 refers to some junction improvements around Solihull Town Centre, which I understand that some work's been done around this. Again, it's also appropriate to provide sustainable modes of transport to promote walking and cycling, particularly towards the main urban area. And again, contributions would be determined really at the outline planning application stage and would form part of a Section 106 agreement.
Thank you. And can you summarise what the land ownership of the site is, please, and whether there's been any developer interest?
Yeah, there are a number of different landowners for this site. However, collaborative work has been undertaken throughout the process, and that has recently culminated in a memorandum of understanding between all the landowners for the site, which I understand has now been signed by all parties. In terms of developer interest, I think those with an interest in the site currently include just the landowners and the site promoters, but it's anticipated that given the area, developer interest is likely to be strong as we go forward. So, yeah.
Can you just confirm? So is it 3 landowners that? Is that correct?
No, I think it's a lot more than 3. I haven't got the exact number, but I think I want to say 13, but there are some representatives of the landowner group here this morning, which could probably confirm that. 40, yeah, I believe it's 14, I believe it's 14.
And so if you just bear with me. Okay, sorry about that. I was just technical hitch there. IT. So there's 14 landowners, did you say?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah, I believe.
And when's the site expected to first come forward?
The site is phased to come forward in the first 2 phases of the plan period, so years 0 to 5 and 5 to 10. In response to your questions on the trajectory of sites, we've assumed that the site could commence in 2024/25 and be completed in approximately 7 years at a rate of 60 dwellings per year for the first 2 years, and then around 116 dwellings per year for the following 5 years. And I believe the landowners in their matter statement have also agreed with those assumptions.
So has the council had any direct discussions with the landowners about the site?
Yes, the council is a landowner on the site in itself, and it is part of that memorandum of understanding. So we have been working with the landowners, for a good couple of years in terms of culminating in this memorandum of understanding, which, again, as I said, I think has been signed by all parties, including the council.
Ms Savage, you've got your hand raised.
Thank you, ma'am. I represent several of the landowners north of Lovetrack Lane, and I just wondered if it would be helpful just to add a couple of lines to what the council have said. In our statement for the hearing session, we submitted quite a lot of detail as to how much work has gone into this site. We as a landowner group, of which there are 14, have met almost monthly for over a year now, and we'd actually met prior to that in 2019, albeit we had a bit of disruption because of the pandemic. We have all signed up to a memorandum of understanding, and we're all working together on an equalisation agreement. So we would echo what Emma has said this morning. We're very confident that delivery will happen in a very timely fashion on the site. We've done a lot of technical work already and in a position to move forward with that if we manage to secure the allocation. And if it is helpful in terms of ownership, there is a plan attached to our reps that were submitted, or our hearing statement that was submitted, which shows the breakdown of the land. That might be useful for you if you wanted to have a look at that. And I think that's probably sufficient for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you. When you say your reference to a lot of technical work that's taken place, could you just expand on that a bit and explain what that includes?
Yes, certainly. It's also set out on the second page of our hearing statement, and it's paragraph 7, just for your reference. And if you just bear with me, I haven't got my reading glasses on today, so I'm just going to have to zoom in. So we've carried out an access appraisal, arboricultural survey work, air quality work, archaeology, preliminary archaeology work, ecological surveys, flood risk and drainage strategies been done. We've had a geo-environmental desk study carried out, heritage statements, landscape and visual impact assessments, noise technical report, obviously a topographical survey of the site, and we've also undertaken a utility survey to date.
And none of those have identified anything of any concern?
No, they haven't, ma'am. Thank you.
Mr. Cuthbert. I think you're on mute, Mr. Cuthbert.
Sorry, Mum. I'm a councillor at Hampton Parish Council and chair of Catherine de Barnes Residents Association, but those organisations have already submitted submissions to you, and I'm speaking to you today personally. Can I make a short statement? It shouldn't take long.
Yes, that's fine.
There are contradictions in the Concept Master Plan 005. The landscape assessment, page 90, shows an area on the southern end of the site marked as an area of notable habitats. But page 92 entitled An Illustrative Concept Master Plan, shows most of this area designated as public open space, with the eastern section allocated to medium density housing. And yet on another page, page 91 on the BDG Master Plan proposal map, shows dwellings on at least 50% of this area. This is somewhat confusing. And as I said yesterday, I'm not sure what part these concept master plans play in the role of the local plan. The site sits within the Meriden Gap, a gap.
I think you've gone on to mute again, Mr. Cuthbert.
Sorry.
Okay.
Are you okay now?
Yes, I can hear you now, thank you.
The site sits within the Meriden Gap, a gap which is classed in para 33 of the plan as a vital strategic gap between Birmingham, Solihull and Coventry. Challenge E, page 17 of the plan, sets out the challenge to protect key gaps between urban areas and settlements with two objectives to meet this challenge. And challenge K, page 20, addresses the protection and enhancement of natural assets, part of the historic Arden landscape and character of the borough. This policy is totally inconsistent with these challenges and objectives in this plan. The inclusion of this site represents a major incursion into the green belt in an area which is particularly sensitive. It crosses the previous existing distinct defensible boundary of Damson Parkway and sets a significant precedent regarding potential future development. It reduces the physical gap between Solihull and Catherine de Barnes. Catherine de Barnes will only be one field, approximately 1 kilometre from the site. The plan states that the site is adjacent to Solihull Town Centre. This is misleading. Solihull Town Centre is 1.5 kilometres away. It's closer to Catherine de Barnes than it is to the town centre. The SA states that the site is 341 metres away from local shops. Only the front edge of the site, most of the site is in excess of 500 metres away from these facilities. I refer, as I did yesterday, to earlier Sheila assessments undertaken by the council, which seem to have had different analysis criteria than the recent assessments, but reached conclusions which are as valid now as they were then. For example, Site 164 in that assessment in 2012 identified potential impacts, and I quote, within the Meriden Gap and contributes to the purposes of the Green Belt, safeguarding the countryside from encroachment and helping prevent coalescence between settlements. Poorly related to existing development, would erode the narrow green belt between Solihull and Catherine de Barnes, impacting on the functions and openness of the green belt, and create an indefensible green belt boundary, setting a precedent for the development of surrounding land. Will be highly visible, landscape conservation, increased traffic flow. Under the heading considered for further allocation, the answer was no. Good accessibility to local services. Release of this site would have a significant impact on the Greenbelt functions and openness and would set a precedent for further Greenbelt land releases from surrounding sites. What has changed, Ma'am? This site is not sustainable. The current site includes a parcel of land north of Lugtrout Lane. 3 recent planning applications on that lane for development on land north of Lugtrout Lane have been refused by Solihull Council on the grounds of inappropriate development in Greenbelt and its openness. The site is poorly served currently by public transport, 1 hourly bus service which does not operate on a Sunday. The policy proposes 2 accesses, one onto Lugtrout Lane. This is a rural narrow lane already subject to speeding issues raised by local residents and now subject to review by Solihull Highways and the Parish Council. The junction with Damson Parkway is narrow and virtually a 3/4 hairpin and is dangerous. The lane forms a rat run during peak times with JLR traffic, particularly using it as a shortcut to Hampton Lane en route to Meriden and Coventry, causing traffic hold-ups at the junction of Lugtrout Lane and Hampton Lane. Damson Parkway itself becomes congested at peak times with traffic extending from the junction of Warwick Bypass down the Damson Parkway. We see this situation getting worse when the newly developed commercial site at the top end of Damson Parkway becomes fully operational and other employment sites in that area in the plan come forward. This site is the 3rd largest plan within the plan with 700 homes, which will have a significant negative impact on this end of the parish. We do not accept that it's an urban extension. It's the first development crossing the boundary in 40 years. If developed, will compromise the distinctiveness of the settlement of Catherine de Barnes, increasing coalescence and creating a significant precedent for future greenbelt development to the east of Damson Parkway. What's the next defensible boundary? Is it the M42? If you look at this site on any map you care to look at, the site sets out and looks like a wart on a vicar's nose. The example I quoted on the Sheila 2012 was only one example. There were several parcels of land included in that assessment and all came with the same conclusions. Please do not bring forward this site, Mum. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Carter?
Thank you, Mum. Can you hear me?
I can, thank you.
I thought I should come in and just back up what all the points that were made by Donna Savage in relation to the landowners and the position. But there was a particular point that was raised by Councillor Cuthbert, which I thought I should come back on. And for the record, by the way, my name is David Carter from Tyler Parks, and I'm representing here Helford Holdings, who own the former Pinfold Nursery to the south of the site, which is the land that Councillor Cuthbert was referring to as part of his statement. That former nursery site has been vacant for over 20 years, and if you've already visited the site, Mark, I'm sure you will have seen how overgrown it is, and it's actually difficult to get on the site, such as the amount of vegetation on there. But the point that I wanted to really get across is that the ecological value of that site was most recently considered in 2019 in the additional site options ecological assessment. And it's the East of Solihull Habitat Biodiversity Audit Partnership for Warwickshire Counts, Coventry and Solihull Warwickshire Wildlife Trusts. And the value of that site was assessed as part of that report, and I think importantly it was rejected as a local wildlife site. The most recent master plan layout, which you will have, includes some housing on that land, but the most valuable areas ecologically are suggested for retention as open space. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan?
Right, sorry, you've got me now. Yes, thank you, Mr. Sullivan, CPRE. Mr. Cuthbert has already referred you to previous assessments, and it's in the Catherine and Hampton statement that the SLAR assessments in 2012 were finding that this location was very unsuitable for development. It contributed to the green belt, and that development would erode narrow green belts and the gap to Catherine de Barnes. So one of the troubles with you get is that if one one assessment says no, and then if that's not wanted, then the next time another consultant is comes up with a proposal that it does it is required. That relates to the green belt classification. I don't know whether well, okay, thank you, I'll continue. What I'd like you to just draw attention, I mean, it's actually page 2 of our statement, that this is actually, in terms of green belt, a very important piece of land because it's outside the line of the Solihull bypass or the A41 and outside the line of Downsend Parkway. And those are two roads built in the last 30 years, I suppose in the 80s. And at that point, Solihull created an eastern boundary of the town, which is the A41 bypass from the Copt Heath interchange on the M42 up to the point of the traffic signals with Downsend Parkway and the Hampton Lane. Then Hampton Lane was built as, Downsend Parkway was built as a way of providing an eastern boundary to the development that was along the old Downsend Lane, which you can see on the map, was allowed to extend to Downsend Parkway. So you have a very clear use of roads to act as a boundary of the green belt. So the point about the nearness to the town centre, well, historically Solihull's shape is what it is, and the bypass land was provided for it, and then it was built, knowing that that side of Solihull was the closest bit to the greenbelt. If you go south of Solihull, you get into areas towards Shirley or Stratford, and in southeast you go towards Knowle and Dorwich, which we're discussing next week. But this particular area is where the greenbelt begins. So what we say in answer to one is we don't understand how it came to be identified, because it is so important as the beginning of the green belt that then runs east to Coventry. So you do not normally locate development of new housing beyond a town's major bypass unless it's going to be a separate settlement with its own services. And of course it isn't. It's said to be dependent on the town centre for all shopping, schools and other needs. So our conclusion is that, and we'll come back to it in relation to the Greenbelt scoring, but that in locational terms, this is a very basic, the important location that has to be kept open if the principle of the Meriden Gap means anything. Otherwise, it is going to reduce the width of the Meriden Gap, which starts at Downsend Parkway and extends to Eastern Green, Coventry, by 750 metres. So that's rather alarming. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Cuthbert.
Mum, I just wanted to stress two things. I'm not speaking as a councillor today. I'm speaking as myself. The submission has been made by the Parish Council and Catherine de Barnes Residents Association. So I'm speaking for myself. I just wanted to clarify the point regarding these master plans. The information I provided were based on the October 2020 master plans, which I believe are the latest ones that are available. Thank you.
Thank you. Would the council like to respond to any of the points that have been made?
Yes, thank you. I'll come back on a few of those points. So as I explained at the start, we see this as an urban extension. The Greenbelt assessment, as we've discussed, does score the site as a lower performing parcel for the purposes of Greenbelt in terms of performs lowly in terms of checking unrestricted sprawl and safeguarding the countryside from encroachment, and the only score that it scores moderately on is that sort of coalescence issue. However, the site is bound by development on two sides. There's a ribbon of development extending out from the urban area towards Field Lane along Hampton Lane. So, you know, Field Lane will form the new defensible boundary, and that gap to Catherine de Barnes will still be maintained. It will be seen as still as a perceivable gap between the settlement and the main urban area. In terms of the comments made in regard to the 2012 Sheila, again, you know, that the planning context has changed and things have moved on, and we are required to, you know, find more land for housing and, you know, to make some difficult decisions, and having regard to the evidence base and the spatial strategy. we consider that the site is suitable for development, being close to the town centre, and the range of services and facilities that are available within a reasonable walking and cycling distance. The commentary in the 2012 SHLA did actually note that the site has good accessibility, and that the presence of existing development and surrounding roads would create that new defensible boundary. In terms of the land toward to the north of Lugtrout Lane, originally that wasn't included in the site allocation. That was put in the 2019 supplementary consultation, where the site was extended to include the land north of Lugtrout Lane, and that ensured that we were making efficient use of land, including brownfield land that's available on the north side of Lugtrout Lane, again in this sustainable location and in accordance with the spatial strategy, and the readily recognisable features of the canal provide a new logical northern boundary. In terms of the accessibility, the accessibility study shows that the site performs well in accessibility terms overall, whilst public transport accessibility may be a little bit lower. Many parcels of the site that make up the site perform well in terms of accessibility to key services like GPs, primary schools, food stores. And again, it's because it's in close proximity to the urban area, it can take advantage of the range of public transport that's on offer there. Again, in relation to the impact on Catherine de Barnes, the council see this as an urban extension, so the allocation is related more to the urban area in terms of being physically and functionally more related to the urban area than it is Catherine de Barnes. And again, that's why it's reflected in the Solihull chapter of the plan rather than the Hampton in Arden chapter of the plan. And again, that gap, although it will be reduced, there will still be a perceptible gap between Catherine de Barnes and the urban area. And again, the council has attempted, with regard to the Meriden Gap issue as well, the council has attempted to protect the integrity of the green belt by using much lower parcels of green belt and seeking to make allocations in locations that are or can be made accessible and sustainable. In terms of transport, I think a colleague might want to come in just to go over a few of those points. So I'll just hand you over to Walter Bailey.
Morning, Mum. Can I just check that you can hear me okay?
I can, thank you.
Excellent. I'm Walter Bailey. I'm from the Council's Transport Planning team. Emma's already touched upon the accessibility of the site, but I just wanted to draw attention to some of the assessment that's been undertaken, some of the infrastructure that's set out within the infrastructure delivery plan. So the transport implications of this site have been considered through application of the West Midlands PRISM model, which is a WebTag compliant multimodal transport model. Document references 308, 309, 316 and 318 set out the approach taken in undertaking that assessment. Table 3.5 of document reference 316 highlights that through the analysis undertaken, there is a need identified for minor improvement to the Solihull bypass Hampton Lane junction, which I believe is what has been referred to as one of the key points of congestion currently, as a result of bringing forward site SO1. So as prompted by policy SO1, this will be further considered through the detailed analysis of impacts on local transport networks through the planning application transport assessment process. But I also wanted to draw attention to the various infrastructure measures set out within document reference 702, the IDP. As Emma's mentioned, this site is considered medium-high accessibility, but we are also focusing our infrastructure improvements on further enhancing that position. So we have, as a council, we have recently delivered a borough-wide wildlife ways programme, which is a £16 million programme that includes a variety of cycle scheme interventions, one of which connects Solihull Town Centre with the airport and Jaguar Land Rover via Dams and Parkway. that is nearing completion now. I think, save for implementation of a couple of road signs, the infrastructure is already delivered. And it's also worth noting that there are improvements planned to the A45 Dams and Parkway Terminal Road junction, so the junction to the north of this site. And that scheme is well developed, has been through public consultation, and has a funding bid logged with the West Midlands Combined Authority. Also worth mentioning that there are 2 bus rapid transit routes proposed, the first of which is going to be delivered next year, that will connect Birmingham city centre and the airport with Solihull town centre, a bus rapid transit route that will run down Lode Lane, so in close proximity to the site. But of further relevance is a future planned bus rapid transit route that will run down Dams and Parkway itself, providing a direct link between Solihull town centre and the airport. Transport for West Midlands proposes to deliver that following completion of the A45 sprint route. So work will commence in earnest post mid-2022, but I understand that feasibility work is already complete. So whilst the site is already considered medium-high accessibility, the focus of interventions within the infrastructure delivery plan is to further enhance that and resolve some of the issues that Mr. Cuthbert has referenced. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan? Mr. Sullivan, are you there?
You have to have a separate basket for glass.
You're on mute, Mr. Sullivan.
Yes, sorry, thank you. The explanation we just had is rather proving that I think the point we're making, that this is in fact all going to be changed into a sort of pretty urban traffic system, which will go across the bypass, and large amounts of additional works will be done. So the rural character of the area that starts at the moment northeast of the A41 just is gone. What you do need to keep in mind, and you can of course adjust the junctions along the A41 to create more waiting space, widen them out, and then use various forms of signals to provide space to cross over, at least safely, at least when the traffic stopped, at the junction with Hampton Lane and the road, the Downs and Parkway route. But in fact, this is a very large area of traffic movement through that point. And this development is northeast of there in what is now Green Belt. So, of course, you can create all these routes, but the whole thing is going to be a really unsatisfactory that this new development, 750 houses, is across the A41 with all its traffic layouts from the town centre. Now, as I say, just listening to Mr. Bailey, I think you can just see how the character of the area ends up having to be completely turned into a route with a lot of traffic on it. And of course, as I say, you can argue that there will be safe routes for people to walk and cycle between this site and the town centre, provided you wait while all the traffic passes. You wouldn't plan like this. It's a way of bodging it up afterwards. In regard to the planning response you just heard, it is helpful to have the council explaining that the SLA work done in 2012 was valid. They're not saying it was wrong. They're just saying, oh, well, now we need to find more housing, and therefore the conclusions of the SLA in 2012 have been set aside as regards the value of this site in the Green Belt. But we will come back to the point of whether there are exceptional circumstances under item. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cuthbert?
Thank you, ma'am. I just wanted to establish, what size does a gap have to be acceptable? I mean, the gap between this site and Catherine de Barnes will be one field. Does it have to be 100 yards? Is that a gap that the council believe is sustainable? I think the position that they're taking is totally unreasonable.
Thank you. Can't see any other hands raised. Is there anything further the council would like to say in response to the most recent points that have been made? Or if there's any other points that anybody else wants to raise before we move on to the next slide?
Yes, ma'am, could I just raise again? Maybe just reiterate what Mr. Sullivan said. I mean, you can't change your mind. The fact that in 2012 the council reached a number of conclusions concerning these sites and various other sites within the parcel, you know, now because it's convenient, their view has changed. But that it doesn't change the fundamental facts that what they said in 2012, nothing has changed. I can see Mr. Andrews doesn't quite agree with me, but nothing has changed. No new developments have happened since then on those sites. So those comments are as valid now as they were in 2012.
Thank you, Mr. Palmer.
Thank you, Mum. Just to come back on a couple of those points. In terms of what size does a gap have to be, that there is no minimum set distance, and it is case sensitive, bearing in mind the nature of the allocation, the nature of the topography of the area, and the nature of the location of the settlements we're looking to avoid coalescence. And I think in this case, when you look at how it works on the ground in terms of the topography, it is considered there is a sufficient gap to ensure that the urban edge doesn't coalesce with Catherine de Barnes. And coming back to the point on evidence prepared for the 2012 plan, of course, there's been a very significant change in circumstances since then in terms of the unmet need that the borough needs to fulfil, not just for its own needs, but also to make a contribution to the HMA needs. And under the 2013 plan, it wasn't even accommodating its own needs at that point. So we would submit that it is a very different context now to which that evidence is used. And again, different from the 2013 plan, where there wasn't significant greenbelt release. There was some in some areas, but not as significant as this plan. To inform this plan, a comprehensive borough-wide greenbelt assessment has been undertaken to inform the choices of which sites come forward.
Thank you. Mr. Cuthbert, is that a new hand?
Yes, ma'am. I just wanted to talk about the new defensible boundary, which is known as Field Lane. Damson Parkway, as you know, is a very wide road and as a defensible boundary. Field Lane, as being now classed as the new defensible boundary, is a very narrow, almost a one-way lane. It's just in the process now of being made a one-way lane on the grounds of safety. It's hardly a comparison in terms of the Damson Parkway as a defensible boundary. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Cannock?
Just briefly, Ma'am, just on this issue of the coalescence of settlements raised by Mr. Cuthbert, and it's an issue which is often raised at EiPs and in Section 78 appeals. I'm just looking at the proposals map document 004. Self-evidently, it's a planning judgment as to whether there is coalescence, and just to invite you to consider that perhaps on two bases. One, whether there's physical coalescence, and I think it's unanswerable that there isn't. And secondly, whether there would be a perception of coalescence, and that's obviously best judged on site, but it's plainly the council's planning judgment that there isn't a perception of coalescence. And I think just when one tries to consider whether there is even a perception of coalescence, decisions that I've read over many, many years addressing this issue, inspectors have asked themselves the questions as to whether the distinctive characteristics of the settlement, which make it a distinct settlement, will be retained? I think that's just a helpful question for you to ask in considering Mr. Cuthbert's objection, because it seems self-evident, at least to the council, that when one looks at it in those terms, that which makes the settlement its own settlement with its own character is not harmed by this development, because no one has identified why this field, which is proposed to be allocated, makes any material, let alone significance, to the distinctive characteristic of the settlement.
Thank you. And Mr. Cuthbert?
Surely, ma'am, it's distinctive in its separation. You know, if there were no fields, there'd be no separation. The fields create separation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, Mum, that self-evidently can't be correct, can it? Because if that was the definition of a distinctive characteristic of this settlement, it would be a distinctive characteristic of each and every settlement. And what that would mean is one could never allocate any land between two settlements. So respectfully, Mum, I think one needs to work just a little bit harder.
Mr. Cuthbert, is that a new hand? Okay, thank you. I don't think there's no more hands raised, so I'm presuming that there's no more points that anybody wishes to raise on this site. So if that's the case, we'll move on to site SO2, which is the Moat Lane Depot. So perhaps somebody from the council could start by explaining how this site came to be allocated, please.
Thank you, Ma'am. So regarding site SO2, the site is a brownfield site in the urban area of Solihull. The MPPF at paragraph 120C says that substantial weight should be given to the value of using suitable brownfield land within settlements for homes. The site currently accommodates the council's Moat Lane Depot, which has got a waste transfer station, which is expected to be relocated during the plan period. The site performs very well in terms of accessibility to all key services and facilities, as well as to public transport. It was promoted through the Call for Sites exercise in 2015 and falls within option A of the spatial strategy, high frequency public transportation corridors and hubs. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any physical or other constraints which could impact on the development of this site?
Yeah, obviously the site is in existing use, so that's a potential constraint in the short term. But the site is expected to come forward in the plan period, and I know the council is actively pursuing options for its relocation, and for that reason it's phased back later in the plan period to come forward in 2032/2033. I think contaminated land has been identified as an issue, given that it's an active use within the urban area, and there's also a telecommunications mast on the site, which the concept master plan suggests we should look to relocate. It's considered that contamination issues and the relocation of the telecommunications mast is something that sort of can be considered at the planning application stage. The site itself is in flood zone 1, but the surface water flooding, but the flood risk assessment work that we've had done does highlight that there are some surface water flooding issues which occur through the centre of the site. So in a scheme going forward, development would have to be kept clear of this and flood alleviation measures put in place.
Thank you. So could you just tell me a bit more about the work that's been done to identify an alternative site for the existing use, please?
Thank you, Ma'am. I think this matter also was picked up in some respects in relation to matter 5 as well, and that was in relation to the council's exploration of alternative sites to accommodate the household waste and recycling centre, so that the intention is that the 2 uses would be brought together as a hub then in terms of as a depot and waste and recycling centre, and work has been done in terms of options, in terms of 4 options being identified, and those are being worked through to take that further. So there has been some work done on exploring sites to accommodate the depot, as I say, jointly with the waste and recycling centre.
I understand the site was allocated in 2013, but obviously it hasn't come forward yet. So why is that?
The site hadn't previously come forward as an alternative site to relocate the depot to, hadn't come forward at that point, but because of the work that now needs to be done in terms of needing to find alternative arrangements for the household waste and recycling centre, it's considered that by joining the 2 together, that is something that can be achieved during this planned period.
And what infrastructure requirements would be needed to support the proposed allocation?
Again, they're set out in the policy, and again they stem from discussions that we've had with providers and from the evidence base, and similar to SO1 really, it's in the same sort of education planning area as SO1, so it's not anticipated that there's any further additional primary places that are required in that area, but that the area should be kept under review, and that's particularly pertinent to this site, particularly as the site is coming forward much later in the plan period. Similarly, secondary school places are sufficient, and there's capacity at the existing Load Heath School to accommodate the demand from this site and from site SO1. And again, it would be a case of discussions with the LEA at the time of application as to what extent contributions are required, and again they'd be secured by a Section 106 agreement. Health, again, discussions with the CCG, and contributions would be required to primary and secondary health care facilities in consultation with the CCG. And again, similarly, because of the locations, appropriate measures to promote sustainable transport options, walking and cycling links towards the town centre, and that will be required. There's a requirement to provide play facilities to meet the demands of development, and again, because of the surface water flooding issues that have been identified, there would be some mitigation required to address those, which then can be incorporated into a landscape and ecology strategy to provide environmental benefits and to support place planning, place making on the site. And again, it's assumed that those contributions would be secured via a Section 106 agreement.
So it's expected that all of the infrastructure will be funded via the development coming forward. Is that the case?
We missed that with our speakers at this end. Would you mind repeating the question?
Oh, sorry. It was just to seeking confirmation that everything that's required from an infrastructure point of view will be funded through the site being brought forward. There's no other external funding that's needed.
Not as far as we're aware, no.
Thank you. I can't see any hands raised. Is there any points that anybody wanted to raise in relation to this site?
Cobb.
Mr. Cobb?
Yes, can you hear me, madam?
I can, thank you.
Yeah. I'm representing Renewal Christian Church, which is located at the corner of Borton Road and Lode Lane, about in the sort of northwest corner of this site, and adjoining it. The Renewal Church are an extremely large church, the largest church in Solihull, and not having a congregation of a few handful, but 2 services on a Sunday before the pandemic, each filled to capacity at 750 congregation. So it's a very big church, and it's also a major player in providing services to the community. I've set out in the statement put in the hearing statement how much they've been doing over the pandemic period, supplying over 200,000 meals to people across the borough. They are a major player working with the council in terms of food banks and also providing support for the community, throwing other churches in Chelmsley Wood and elsewhere. But there's no provision in the local plan for them to expand. The master plan which I put in with my statement is one which was developed in consultation with a number of architects to provide the facilities for them to almost double in size. And naturally, they would look to potentially discussing with the council taking part of the site at Moat Lane Depot. We had some early discussions with the council. We weren't discouraged from bringing our proposals to some form of master plan, but in doing so and submitting that, we were rebuffed. So the concern we have is that the NPPF, particularly paragraph 93, paragraph A, asks for local planning authorities in plans to plan positively for the provision of a number of community facilities, including places of worship. There's no provision in this plan for that, but no indication that the council have indeed tried to discuss it with any worship groups who might need to expand their accommodation, such as this one. So we feel somewhat frustrated in able to find some location for Renewal Church to do what it needs to do and wants to do. No site can be identified that we can find. The nearest one and the nearest obvious one on the doorstep is part of Moat Lane Depot. And the church is very happy to work with the council jointly and with others to provide the accommodation they need, and also some, if not all, of the housing allocation on a more dense part of the site. So we're looking for some support from the council, if not on this site, elsewhere. And I've made representations on matter 11 later on the very point of the lack of provision for places such as places of worship or combined shared spaces for meetings. And the current site is used for many meetings, National Health Service, businesses and so on, because there's no other facility in Solihull for large venues. This site would provide a large venue for meeting facilities. So we see certainly possibly a further discussion with the council about use of Moat Lane Depot as and when it starts to become available, that we can take forward jointly and provide facilities for a place of worship and the additional housing that the council are needing on this site. We don't object to the allocation of the housing site as such, but we do need to see some provision being made for Renewal Church to be able to expand to the limit that it wants to. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. I think we'll come back to this discussion later in the examination in relation to community facilities, but does the council want to make any comments in relation to this site specifically and the comments that Mr. Cobb has made?
Yeah, I'll just come back briefly. So obviously the examination is considering this site as an allocation for residential development in the plan. As we've discussed, it's not phased to come forward until 2032-33, so it is quite far back in the plan period. So I'm not sure how that would fit in with the church's sort of timescales. I'm not aware that we've had any detailed proposals regarding the church's future aspirations and the potential options, I suppose, for meeting these. Policy P19 of the plan is sort of an enabling policy for community and uses and social infrastructure. So there is provision in the plan for community uses. So yeah, that's our position on that.
Thank you, Mom. If I may add as well, I think whilst recognise some may have a different view on alternative uses that could be accommodated on the site, what we would say in our submissions is that the plan has put forward for the site to be allocated for residential development is a sound allocation, and it's one that seeks to maximise the use of previously developed land in the urban area to contribute towards the significant housing need that we have to accommodate in the borough.
Thank you. Are there any other points that anybody wishes to raise on this site? Mr. Sullivan?
I just clarify, are we going on back to on SO1? Are we going on to the conclusions of the strategic greenbelt assessment and the exceptional circumstances? Are you coming back to that next?
No, we're on site SO2 now. We've concluded the discussions on SO1.
Well, no, but the point about SO1, man, was that there were the subjects which were in, as I said when I spoke, was that the greenbelt assessment and the parcels were the next subject in the list, and we haven't dealt with those. And then the other question was the exceptional circumstances test, which you haven't been through yet. I don't quite understand. Surely we were coming on to those in the agenda after because you've only dealt at the moment with the reasons for the allocation.
No, we've just been talking about site SO2 at Moat Lane Depot, and before that we were talking about site SO1. If there's something specific that you wanted to say about SO1 that you haven't, then you can say that now, but we have moved on from that site, and I did ask if there was anything else that anybody wanted to raise, and nobody said anything.
I don't actually understand this one, I'm sorry, because you only dealt with the question is what was the background to the site allocation and how was it identified? And you didn't come on as you did last year.
It doesn't really matter. The point is, if there's something you want to say about that site, then please say it now.
Well, let me, as I say, you have a number of statements, but you haven't yet dealt with what the exceptional circumstances test is. You haven't asked the council to go through that.
I think I did, but if there's something you want to say about the exceptional circumstances, then please say that. You've got the opportunity to say that now.
Well, sir, ma'am. I mean, as I say, we've written out on page 3. I did say when I thought you were coming back to a specific question about the parcels, and we haven't dealt with it yet, which was the way in which the parcels were defined. RP29 has got a very low scoring because it includes the ribbon development, which has been there since the 1930s, along Hampton Lane. And what I pointed out is that that's entirely that leads to it only having 1 point. If you go through your questions, what are the conclusions? This is your questions too. What are the conclusions of the strategic greenbelt assessment in relation to contribution of land in question? And you need to consider, has in fact the Atkins assessment properly given the right parcel? In other words, should the by putting all that ribbon development along Hampton Lane into the same parcel, the parcel's got devalued down to 1. But if you actually didn't include that, but the parcel was just the land that is proposed for development, then it goes up to 2 or 3. And we've set out why. And then if you include another factor, which we set out, you should get a score for SO1 of 6 or 7 and not 4. Now that's the important point for the greenbelt assessment. I know they said when the SLA from 2012 was quoted, oh, well, life has moved on. But the fact is that there's something basically wrong with the way the Greenbelt assessment was done for SO1. So that's on our page 3. Now, the question, ma'am, we've also set out, which is, are there exceptional circumstances to alter the Greenbelt in this particular case? Well, yes, the council's statement, actually quite long, goes into that. And I must say, I thought, no, you're going to come back to some of the things they've written further along. What you have to ask is, how did they get to a situation where they decided exceptional circumstances to alter the Greenbelt in this particular case arise, when they haven't compared it with other locations? And a particular point we make, which you haven't picked up but needs to be questioned, is that when this proposal was put into the draft plan, Regulation 16 in 2016 or 2015 even, there was no serious or clear proposal for housing at the not very far away UK Central. And what we pointed out in page 1 and 2 of our statement is that since this proposal was put in, along has come a much larger housing development at the UK Central, not very far away to the northeast. And we set out the numbers there, which are now said to be 2740, though some people are talking about even more. And so point out that in the light of that, SO1 should have been reviewed before publication of the submission draft against the higher provision in UK Central. The change in planned housing provision at UK Central from the lower figure of 2000, which was the number used in the sustainability assessment done by AECOM, not Atkins, AECOM, in May 2020, was increased by 740 houses in the October 2020 local plan submission draft. And that's a point which was made in the earlier session. But what that immediately points you to is, why is 700 houses at SO1, it was originally 650, still being retained? If there were exceptional circumstances for moving the SO1 land from the Greenbelt up to early 2020, they ceased to exist when 740 extra houses were added to the UK Central allocation in the October 20 submission draft. And at that point, the SO1 should have been removed from the plan at the time. Now, that's when you, on your question, are there exceptional circumstances to alter the Greenbelt in this particular case, which I did think you were coming on to, that they don't now exist. If they did exist before the increase in numbers at UK Central, they don't now. And that's a very important point for you to consider as to why this is still in the plan. We've set that out, and in regard to the other questions, which I don't know if we're coming on to, about Greenbelt enhancements or infrastructure, well, I think we've noted that Hampton Parish Council have made statements on that.
Thank you. Mr. Palmer, Ms. Tinsley Evans, did you want to respond to those points?
Thank you, ma'am. I don't think we've got a particular wish to revisit some of those points, which I think you made a note of in our submissions earlier this morning, and are covered in our statement questions 2, 3, and 4. But one point, just picking up on that matter in relation to the changing capacity that was included in the draft plan and the draft submission plan. We recognise that as plans move from draft stage to Reg 19 stage, we do have to update the land supply that is coming forward at different sites. That doesn't mean to say that if one site has more capacity coming forward, that there's an automatic reduction elsewhere. I think our position on the overall housing requirement was set out clearly for matter 3, and both the residential component coming forward at UK Central and this site make an important contribution to meeting housing needs across the borough as a whole when seen in the round.
Well, thank you. If that's the answer, I think you've got the answer that I'm right, because they haven't actually made an assessment, having increased the numbers, and they don't dispute they increased the numbers at UK Central by the number that's in our statement between the time the essay was done by ACOM and the time the plan was submitted in October. At that point, we've got the numbers, and they're not disputed by Mr. Palmer. That would indicate that there should have been a review of why SO1 was still there. And he's saying, no, well, we've got just additional land, and so we can allocate more housing. Now, that really removes the exceptional circumstances case for SO1. And it's clear that the council haven't actually thought of this point. They haven't explained why, having quite openly and said in their plan the numbers at OK Central have gone up by that number, and again the numbers are not in dispute, that therefore SO1 now doesn't fulfil the requirement that it may have done before. The exceptional circumstances, which are a bit difficult to see what the council's exceptional circumstances are, really gone. Unless you're going to say, and obviously we weren't entitled to sit at the matter 5 on the NEC site, but it's not suggested by the council that they aren't going to deliver that housing, so that you do have the case for saying the exceptional circumstances that existed, if they were there, have gone now. So I just want to stress that, because the council's had the opportunity, they've now said no, they're not going to raise that. So I think you've got the point now that there isn't a case for the 700 houses here.
Mr. Palmer.
I'm sorry. Sorry, Ma'am, that's not a point that we would accept. I think in relation to the sustainability appraisal, that has been updated through the course of preparing the plan, and the sustainability appraisal considered alongside the draft submission plan fully considered the impact of the level of growth, including these sites and including that would be provided at UK Central. And in relation to this particular site, it's important to remember that the exceptional circumstances exist on 2 levels. There's a strategic level in terms of the contribution needed towards what would otherwise be unmet housing needs for the borough and beyond, and the local exceptional circumstances, which, as I say, went through earlier this morning.
Well, just to confirm, again, the numbers are not in dispute. So I think you have to conclude, and we raised this before, that the increased numbers at UK Central were only put in after the SA was done. The SA was not changed. The SA is May 2020, and that was pointed out. There isn't another SA that takes that increases the numbers at UK Central to 22,740. ACOM did not come back and do any more work after May. And if Mr. Karma's got some other document that says that the SA was actually changed or was added to after the May date, which is the one we've all got, then I think he should submit it, because I'm certainly asking you, ma'am, to conclude that the figure that, as I say, at top of our page 2, our statement for UK Central was not in the SA. There's quite clearly 2,000 in the SA. It says so. We discussed it in the first week. It's very unfortunate that the council seems to think, well, it can agree to that, and then there's no implication anywhere else. But as a stressor, and this is our point, that I think you should be examining it.
Mr. Palmer.
back on that, I'd refer to document reference 030, which is a sustainability appraisal, the main report, which is dated September 2020.
Well, it's May was the date when the sustainability appraisal I've seen actually was written, and that's when the numbers were. So I don't believe that there was an assessment of SU 740 houses at UK Central by ACOM. Is Mr. Palmer saying there was?
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I've heard your
Sorry,
points on
can I
it.
just
And
clear, is Mr. Palmer saying that actually ACOM did come back and assess 2740 at UK Central? No, he's not saying that. Well, I think you've got the conclusion, ma'am, that I'm correct about that.
Mr. Palmer, are you able to confirm that?
I'm just looking at the tables. If I refer to table 5.3, the alternatives there do include 2,500 at UKC Hub.
Okay, thank you. I don't think there's any other points that anybody wishes to raise because there's no hands raised. So on that basis, we'll draw the conclusion that there's nothing else that anybody wanted to raise, and we'll end this session now. So we'll be coming back at 2 o'clock for matter 6D. So thank you all for your contributions this morning. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.